everyone, I'm going to be going over how to do some basic compositing in Blender, this time for a bloom effect. So just a reminder, compositing is an additional stage that we do in between the first render to get the image sequence and the second render to get the actual video. And the compositing lets you really enhance your image sequence or your image and sort of like working with special effects, but it can really polish the end result significantly. So I have a scene that is set up here with a ground plane, some different cubes, a couple other planes at the top that are going to be for another demo later on, and the red cube is animated. I have a few different materials. I have a glass material, I have a couple of emission materials, so a few different things going on, and everything is all organized in collections. So when you're doing compositing, before you do the first render, there's actually some setup that you need to do, and the setup changes depending on the type of compositing that you're doing. So I already have my render settings set up the way that I want to. Over in output settings, I've set my own output location, and I am going to change the format here specifically to the OpenEXR multi-layer. This is the best format for compositing because it can save additional data as part of the file. So OpenEXR multi-layer. So otherwise just set whatever render settings you want. And then I'm going to head over to the view layers. So the view layer lets us control what additional data gets included, and you can actually create multiple view layers that you can change between up here at the top, and we'll do that later on in another demo. For this one, we just need a single view layer, and there are what we call passes with different data that we can save as part of the file. And so when I'm working with bloom and I want to really enhance the glow of the material, specifically the glow of the emission material, I just want to come over to the light passes, and all I'm going to do is just check emission. So I have combined, I have emission, that's all I need. Now I am going to, again, make sure I have my own save location so it's not the temp folder. I have the OpenEXR multi-layer format, and I'm going to limit the range just to, I don't know, maybe I'll do frame 15, which is active right now. And I'm just going to be rendering a single image to start from. So I'm choosing my start and my end to the same number, so it'll just render that frame. So this is going to be a test render to make sure everything looks the way that I want it to. So I'm just going to come over, render animation. It's going to render out just this one frame, but because I chose render animation, it's going to save it in my render location with the correct file format. Now, the reason that I'm not rendering out the whole sequence is that if there's anything wrong with my render when I start doing the compositing, this way I'm not wasting all of that time rendering and then needing to go back and make changes and render again. So sometimes I might do a small range, like 3 frames. In this case, all I want is just the 1 frame. So that is all set. So I am just going to save my file and make a new one. So Command N, so new general file again. And I'm going to switch over to the Compositing tab, and I'm going to completely ignore everything that's in the file. It's going to be ignored. I need to tell it to use nodes. I have the composite node, which is going to control the actual output. When the composite node here is active, because we're using the nodes, it's going to completely override anything in the scene itself. Now, I specifically like to do my compositing in a separate file so that I don't have to worry about it unintentionally impacting the original file. Just sort of better to keep things separate. All right, so I have my composite node. I got rid of the render layer. I'm going to use Shift A, and I'm going to search for an image node. And I'm also going to search Shift A for a viewer node so I can actually see what I'm doing. And I'll be connecting these together. But first of all, I'm going to open my image or my image sequence So I'm just going to head to my Bloom folder. Right now I just have a single EXR, so I'm going to select it and open. And if I connect this to the viewer, I can see what the image looks like as is. So just from dragging from this combined socket to the image socket. Now I need to add a glare node in between these. So Shift A, and I'm going to search for glare. And I'm just going to connect also from image to image. And I'm just going to move these off to the side. I do want to mention for the viewer that we're looking at, if we go to the view options in the N tab, so just N to toggle that open and close, I can zoom this in or out, so I can make it bigger or smaller depending on what's helpful to see. I can also move it around to another location if I'm not happy with the location. All right, so I have my glare node connected from combined to image, and then from image to image for both the viewer and composite nodes. Now I'm going to change this up to high, and I'm going to lower the threshold because the threshold is really going to be impacting the range that this is looking at. And you can see that's giving a little bit of a glow to my white material. Now, something to be aware of, if you're doing the bloom effect like this, where you're using the combined socket, you're not going to be able to have quite as much control. So if I had skipped the emission pass, this is a way I could get bloom. I can change between several different styles. I can change between high, medium, and low. I can increase and decrease the threshold, the size. Lots of things I can adjust depending on what I prefer. Now, a better way to do this would be to keep the glare node, but to actually add a mix node, specifically mix color. And I'm going to connect to both the composite and the viewer node from my mix node. And I'm going to switch from combined to the emission socket, and that image is going to go down below, and the combined socket is going to come up at the top. So what this mix is doing is that it's combining the two passes together, so the combined pass and the emission pass with glare applied to it, and then it's mixing them together. So sort of putting them, just fusing them together. Now the factor here determines whether the top image or the bottom image socket has more of an impact. So if I put this to 0, it is just the original image without any glare. If I have like 0.5, it's going to be halfway between the two. Now, something that you might notice is that this is adding the glare effect or the bloom. I can certainly keep experimenting with my settings depending on how dramatic I want this to look, but it's specifically working on the emission pass, and it's not based on just being the lightest material that's there or the whitest material that's there. So this is going to give you much more control over where the bloom ends up if you have multiple white things or multiple light things in your camera view. So I can certainly keep experimenting with the settings, and the type has a huge impact, like ghost, and then the number of iterations, or streaks, or fog. Again, lots of settings that are going to have an impact on how dramatic these are, and depending on what's going on in the file, sometimes certain ones are going to be more effective than others. You are going to find, though, that a lower threshold is going to give you a much more dramatic result than a higher threshold. So it's more likely to be effective. All right, so that is how you get bloom set up on the compositing side. So at this stage, I would just save my compositing file, or actually I will. So save the compositing file, and I'm just going to name it the same thing as my other file, but I'm just going to add a C to the end of the name so that I know this is the version that's specifically for the compositing. And I'm going to switch back over to my original, and I'm just going to fix the range to actually be, or actually I'm going to do this a little bit shorter, going from 1 to 30, and I'm going to render the entire sequence out. So once the entire sequence is rendered, then I'll pull that back into the compositing file and I can render directly to video from there. So I will be back when the render is finished. All right, the render has finished, or at least as much as I'm going to let it render. So I'm going to just save my original file and head back over to my compositing version. Over here, I'm just going to the image node, selecting the full range of the sequence that I rendered. It's in the correct order, so I don't need to worry about that. And I can just open. Right, now something to be aware of is that this is not going to play through in real time if I play in the timeline. Like, it has to do a little bit of calculating, but I can just move the needle and sort of scrub through and see how it looks on the different frames. So not real-time playback, but enough to have an idea of what's happening. So this does stop at frame 20, but there we go. And then to get to video from here, I'm just going to head over to the resolution settings. I recommend doing the exact same size settings that you had in the original file, just to make sure there aren't any issues. This is only 20 frames, so I'm changing the end frame. I usually just render the videos to the desktop, but if you've got other locations, certainly choose that. So I'm just going to change the format to video. Under encoding, I'm going to choose whichever encoding I want to go with. I might want to go with QuickTime in my case, but certainly feel free to experiment. And when I go to render animation, it is just stitching the images together with that little bit of compositing. So it's going to be really fast. So if I come over to the desktop, I can see my video, I can play it through, and it looks as expected. And it just has that bloom effect, so a nicer glow than the default emission material will have. And that's the basics of compositing a bloom effect.